Welcome to our Fireside series from Christ Church The Branch. I'm sitting here with Elder Keith Peterson, and I'm going to ask him some tough questions today that maybe some of you have been interested in. In Christ Church The Branch, we're called Mormon fundamentalists. Generally, that's just the shorthand term for any church or group that still practices plural marriage, often called polygamy. Celestial plural marriage is one of the doctrines that Mormonism believes in. Even the mainstream of the church, even though they don't practice polygamy anymore, they still have section 132 in their Doctrine and Covenants, which talks about plural marriage. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit. You grew up in Christ Church, you grew up in the branch, in a plural family. And I wanted to ask this kind of the tough question that a lot of people ask in the branch is, why plural marriage? Why do you still believe in it? Why do you practice it? Why does it even exist, really? I think a lot of people kind of wonder. And so I wanted to ask you this question as somebody who grew up in a plural family. Why do you believe in plural marriage?
Why do I believe in plural marriage? Well, obviously the first answer would be because, it was taught by the prophets. But okay. I think the real question is, what does it serve, right? What purpose does the principle serve, kind of thing? And for me, I have three explanations for the why and what it does. So, the first off, the purpose of the principle of plural marriage is for, produce a righteous seed, right? Righteous generation.
Okay, so to create a certain kind of family.
Yeah, exactly. Because one of the things we understand is parents, they have a big impact on who their children are going to be later in life, right? And so when you have children born in this righteous household, God-fearing household, they're more likely to actually be God-fearing adults, kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. To show respect to God and teach their children the same thing. So if we want to have Christ-like people that has a higher degree of chance that they actually all believe in God, you would want them to be in a family that actually believes in God, like a Christian household.
Okay, that raises them in a certain way, nurtures them, things like that. Okay, so plural marriage, you're saying you think that maybe it's actually good for the kids.
It is good for the kids. For me,
okay.
In a way, it is and isn't. There are benefits and there are drawbacks. Especially today, where we all know that plural marriage is kind of frowned upon and is not something that is seen as should be, kind of thing, right? But honestly, when people come to me and they're like, "Well, what was it like?" Like these people that are out of the church, like, what was it like being in a plural family? Was it weird? Was it different? They seem like it's going to be like the most different thing in the world, like an alien-like experience. But I'm like, she had another mother, right? She was just there that you had to also make sure she wasn't watching when you're doing something wrong. So,
gotcha. So maybe one of the effects on kids is that there's more eyeballs.
There's
more caregivers. There's more people around.
Right, but there's more love, right? There's more people you can go to for comfort and for love and everything like that. It's also a larger family. It's a continuation of growing love, not from just one woman but multiple women. Right? So, because each of these individuals, they have a certain amount of love that they give to each other, and because there's more wives, there's more mothers, there's more children, more love and such. So it's just a bundle of love that is there for the purpose of building a family, right?
That's great. Okay, so that's the first reason. What's the second reason?
The second reason is, this is probably most important to why it's talked about in Doctrine of Plural 132, and why it's necessary, in my understanding, to become exalted, become like God, right? Because, I don't know if you all know this, but we believe he's a polygamist, right? Okay,
so to become more like God, living this principle is a way of imitating the divine plan, because you're saying God is in a celestial plural marriage. Which is kind of interesting, because I think a lot of times people think of God as just, some old guy with a beard who's all by himself. They don't really think of God as married or having a family. But yeah, in Mormonism, we have this idea that we are children of God. That makes us part of God's family.
Yes, exactly.
Right? If God has kids, but how could God have kids if God doesn't have a wife?
Right, Heavenly Mother. And the thing is that we do believe, and you don't have to if you don't want to, but we do believe that God is married. At least we believe he had one wife. And the thing about it is, the reason, though, we believe he had three, and this was necessary to become as he is it's a combination of love again. And how I like to explain it as a way my mother actually taught me a long time ago, the way she understood it. So, imagine every single person has a bubble, right? A little bubble of...
The bubble of influence, maybe?
Bubble of influence. Picture everyone has like a bubble, like a little soap bubble kind of thing, all around them. And each person for this bubble represents their righteousness, represents their justice, kindness, and everything they have for the world, right? Okay. Whenever you follow a commandment, that bubble increases.
Okay, that goodness gets bigger.
Yeah,
okay.
goodness, that's a better way of putting it. So the goodness bubble, right, can only reach a certain extent, though. Each individual can only get to a certain point before you can't get any more righteous by yourself. And so when a man and woman come together in marriage, though, and they come sealed together, they come together, the bubble becomes one, right? It becomes a bigger bubble. It exceeds the cap it could have had by themselves. And so the goal here, though, is to reach a certain goodness that God has, right? Where he has a certain amount of righteousness, a certain amount of love and everything like that. And we can't do that by ourselves, right? And so even with these two people, though, it's still not enough. So what needs to happen is you need even more goodness. You need even more of an increase. And so that's why another member comes part of the family and increases even more.
Okay, so this is kind of like this idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, they'll say, right? Like, two people isn't just two people. In one person can only do so much. Two people can actually do more than two individuals can do on their own. Together, there's that X factor. There's something more that they can bring. And in plural marriage, you're saying this multiplication of power, of relationships, of understanding, of goodness, whatever these blessings are, it's kind of exponential. It grows, it multiplies.
Right.
Instead of just being added, it grows and grows and grows.
Yes.
Right? So adding more people makes it bigger, faster.
It's more love, it's more goodness, it's more righteousness. Because the thing is that we don't believe in a God that's divided, right? He's not separate. Unity in marriage is extremely important, right? It's in the scriptures everywhere that marriage is something that everyone should be a part of, right? And so if it's so important, it would only make sense God himself would be married, right? Because if God is going to teach people to do something, and I actually had a talk about this as in one of the videos, he has to be willing to follow as well, right? He can't command us to any commandment and then say, I'm not going to follow it, though. You have to. That's a law for you, not me.
So when God gives us a commandment, it's part of his nature, right? God is good.
Yes.
And so if he asks us to do something, it's because he himself does it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
And so that's why it says, thou shalt not kill, because God doesn't go about killing people kind of thing, right? And so that's the thing, is that if marriage is so important, there has to be a reason for it, right? And God himself is married, and when it comes to plural marriage, that's why it's just the next step towards marriage. Kind of like all of the principles of the gospel, right? When you have the Old Testament, Christ says he's fulfilled that kind of thing. It goes to a greater understanding of the law, right?
Right, yeah. So like in the New Testament, Jesus doesn't come in and say, oh, we really screwed up. All the commandments don't mean anything. We're going to start over. He says, well, before time, they gave you this standard. But I'm going to give you an even higher understanding, a higher standard, a better way of understanding, right? So one thing adds on another, and it grows and grows, right?
Yes,
Principle, what do they say? They say line upon line, precept upon precept, right? It grows in our understanding. And so, yeah, Jesus doesn't do away with the old law. He gives us a higher law. And so marriage is good, and therefore more marriage, in other words, plural marriage, is an even higher law.
Right, exactly.
I see.
And so, the third one is kind of the first one I said before. It's because God commanded it, right? It's because it was something that was given to us, so we need to follow it. So those are the three reasons that I, for myself, know, and is why I believe it.
Okay. And, when God requires something of us, that might sound like that's the simplest way of understanding it. God said it. I believe it. Let's do it. Is one way of looking at it, but... right, that's the surface level, but then you look deeper and you find these other reasons that, actually, there's benefits to these things. Now, let me ask you some of the tough questions. Of course, one of the reasons why people are often concerned about Christ Church practicing plural marriage is because there's a lot of negative stereotypes, there's a lot of concerns, and of course, real lives, real marriages are kind of messy. Sometimes the marriages are good, sometimes they're not so good, sometimes they end in divorce. And there's no exception to that just because you're trying to live a higher law. There's still problems, right? And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that in the branch, in Christ Church. How do you see the difficult side of things get handled? Or why is there a testimony? Your own moms right? Your own moms have had their struggles.
Yes.
Maybe you could share with us a little bit about why do they believe it? Why did they choose this?
Why do they choose this? Why do they believe it? Now, that's a very good question. They both have their own experiences for why they do it specifically. Mm-hmm. But the way that it's generally handled is communication, right? You always have to be willing to, in any marriage, any household, be willing to communicate. Mm-hmm. And I feel that they hold on to it because they know that there are the blessings that are obtained through it. They both have, even though we all have the same, my brothers and sisters have the same father, the mothers still believe, and actually many instances they see their sister wife as a sister. Like, that's how it's been described.
Right, because they're in a family relationship with each
exactly.
other. Even, and I think that sometimes in English we don't have the right words for it, and that's why we've come up with terms like sister wife.
Yes.
Right, to show that there's this relationship of family connections just between them. Even if the man isn't around, right? Mm-hmm. They have their own relationship as well.
Right, and you're going to have your conflicts, right?
Sure.
Especially even if we consider them as sisters, because sisters always have conflicts as well. It's
That's
just their
true.
nature. Right. And so
I have 4 daughters, and they don't always get along. I get that.
Right. There's always the ups and downs kind of thing. But the thing is that's why it's a challenge. Brigham Young said that this principle would damn more than would save, right? And that's why we're not calling everyone to live this principle. In fact, currently, this may change later, only about 30% of the church actually lives plural marriage, right?
Right.
Not every single family you're going to find has multiple wives. This is something that is a calling given to certain men and women who are in a state of being, maybe testimony-wise, where they would be strong enough that if those conflicts come up, they are willing to persevere and go through them, right? If you were to be given to a family that wouldn't be ready for those conflicts, it would have been given them, right? That's why it's a calling. It's not just something that is said, you have to do this now because it's a commandment. It's not just like the same as saying, go to church every Sunday kind of thing.
Right, like we tell everybody thou shalt not kill. We tell everybody you should seek unto God, have a testimony. We try to get allow or invite everyone in the world to be baptized, right? But we're not out there trying to tell everybody, oh, you should marry a bunch of wives, you should all live in plural families, yes. Right? It's kind of one of those principles that's only there's a time and a place. And some people are called to it, and others aren't.
Yes.
And so that does make a big distinction, because I think that's part of the other problem too, is a lot of people worry, well, if I'm not ready for this, or I'm not comfortable with it, am I going to be pressured into doing something I don't want to do, or I'm not ready for? Yeah.
George Q. Cannon actually gave a talk in the Journals of Discourse, Volume 1, page 65, I believe it is. You may check me. But the talk was on celestial plural marriage, right? And what he said was, well, how are these things be conducted? Is every man left at liberty to go to and fro, taking wives unto themselves? He said, no. These things were orchestrated under the strictest laws in the past, and that's how it's supposed to be to this day. He actually compares the example of Nathan the prophet coming to King David and telling King David, telling him, you shouldn't have taken Bathsheba to be your wife, and killing Uriah the Hittite, and telling him about the wives he had lost through it. Inside the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel 16:12, I believe it is, might be different, I know it's in there, but it is after he comes and tells David the story of the rich man and the poor man. One had many sheep, one had one land, right? And he says that the Lord has given you your master's house, Saul, and your master's wives, and your master's property. And if that had been too little, he would have given you such and such, more such things, right? So God actually wasn't against the idea of David having more than one wife. Right?
Oh, clearly not, right? Not only did God say, I gave you more than one wife, he said, I would give you even more wives.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And it's interesting, too, because that's not just a man saying, my opinion is, or whatever. This is God saying, I, the Lord, am giving this as a blessing. Right? So, yeah, that's an interesting point. I was actually reading in the book of Exodus about... And we were surprised at several references to plural marriage there that my wife was pointing out, saying, oh, look, right here, the Lord is commanding this, and the Lord is explaining this. And at no point is he condemning this. So it is interesting. You do see plural marriage throughout the scriptures if you're looking for it.
Oh, yeah.
Or if you're not trying to pretend it isn't there.
Yeah. I know Christians that literally believe plural marriage is real as principle.
Right, even with no contact with Joseph Smith or the Revelations, the Doctrine of Covenants, or anything like that.
Yeah, we've had contacts come to us. They're like, no, I'm Christian, but I believe that plural marriage is principle, so I want to look into your church. Like, that literally has happened in the past.
It's interesting.
But what I was trying to bring up with the Journals Discourse quote is, to continue it, inside the quote, it explains that these things can only be directed by one of the Lord's anointed, right? Just same as it was with Nathan and David's day, because that was Nathan's position. He was there with the priesthood authority to say, you should marry this other wife and this other wife, kind of thing, right? He was there giving the calling to take multiple wives.
Right.
And so that's what's important, is we have to recognize that it has to be a calling given by one of the Lord's anointed, or one of the Lord's called, those called to give in this position to call someone to that. We can't just call ourselves.
Right, and so basically you've got both of those examples in David's life. David was given wives by God, but then David also did his own thing and took when it wasn't given to him. And then and so he was rightly blessed when he obeyed God, and rightly punished when he disobeyed God. Even though from the outside, from a worldly point of view, it's like, well, what's the difference? Can't we just do whatever we want? And I guess the answer is, in marriage, in Christ Church, we believe you can't just do whatever you want. If you want God's blessings, you have to follow God's plan for it. Now, this is leading me to another question about this that I want to ask. There's a lot of Mormons, a lot of people in the mainstream LDS Church who will say, well, yeah, we sort of agree with you so far. It's good when God commands it, and it can be bad if you're doing this on your own. Why can't we just go with the mainstream LDS viewpoint then, where God says, they assume that their president of the church right now says you can only be married to more than one wife if one of them is dead, right? Russell M. Nelson is president of the LDS Church right now, and the next in line is Dallin H. Oaks. Both of them have 2 wives sealed to them each, but the first wife died before they took the next wife. And so even though the sealing ordinance kind of makes them polygamous in the spiritual sense that they are sealed to more than one woman, but they didn't live it the way you're talking about in this life. They think that God can just lock it all up and say, no more, right? So a lot of people view the manifesto of 1890 as being this moment when God said, oh, well, yes, I assigned certain people before, but I'm rescinding that permission from the entire world. No one gets to do this anymore at all. Oh, why would you disagree with that position?
Well, it's interesting because you bring up the manifesto like you say that God brought the manifesto, which is interesting.
That's the way some people feel about it.
Which is interesting because if you look at, and this is something you probably already know, and you know I'm about to bring up.
Go ahead.
But when it comes to the manifesto, every revelation from God has always been, thus saith the Lord, right? This is from God kind of thing, right?
Right, yeah, the whole point is that God is speaking to man, right? That's what makes it a revelation.
Yes. The very beginning of the manifesto is not, thus saith the Lord, is two who may be concerned, right? And then it continues on. Wilford Woodruff signed the manifesto in, I forget the year, but
1890. Yep.
Thank you. And the government saw this as a church, as so many church membership did as well. This is the end of the principle of plural marriage. No, we're not living anymore. Well, interesting enough, a few decades later, Joseph F. Smith, the president of the church, is still living plural marriage. He's still taking wives, right?
Right. Well, my understanding is even Wilford Woodruff actually took a plural wife after the manifesto.
Yeah. And so I can recall an experience where I was told that actually there were men who came to Joseph F. Smith on this exact topic, and they asked, President Smith, why are you still practicing plural marriage when we said we weren't going to be living anymore? And he said, well, where does it say that? And so they brought forth a manifesto that was signed by Wilford Woodruff, and he said, all right, read it out to me. He said, all right, two whom we concern. Stop there. It doesn't concern me.
Doesn't concern me.
That's the thing, though, is that the manifesto is in accordance with the calling thing because it only concerns those who have not been called. Those who have not been called are those it is concerns that should not be living the principle of plural marriage. This actually keeps room for another revelation, which is known as the 1886 revelation, right? And
so that's just a few years before the manifesto.
Yeah, exactly. And the 1886 revelation itself is a revelation that was actually, we have a little pamphlet on it, that was given by John Taylor.
Nice. And tell us a little bit about that story.
So, it's September 26, 1886, in Centerville, Utah, I believe it is.
Okay.
I've got my facts right. John Taylor, at this time period, this church was being persecuted by the government, right? The same as it was during the time of Wilford Woodruff's time. So, It was to the point that John Taylor would have to go from safe house to safe house, aka go into memberships, many memberships' homes where they were not going to turn him into the government because he had a price in his head. Right?
So basically, there's wanted posters out there, and Wilford Woodruff and John Taylor and all these guys, they're on the run.
Yes.
Right. Otherwise, they'll be thrown in prison for basically just on the basis of their beliefs.
Yes.
I mean, ostensibly, it's because they practice plural marriage, but I think they just wanted the leaders of the church rounded up.
Yeah, and under the excuse from what, I heard recently, the excuse the government had was if you're a Christian denomination, you should be following Christian teachings, and this is not a Christian teaching, so you can't be following it. So that's why they were saying they had the obligation to stop them.
Right, there's supposed to be a separation of church and state in this country, but it is true that if you look at the rhetoric from that time, it's pretty explicit that they were saying, oh, well, we wouldn't want to let people who aren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestants to be Americans. You're only a true American if you're white and you speak English and you're Protestant and all of these things. And I think that we've hopefully grown past that now mostly. But yeah, there was this concern that, oh no, these Mormons are bringing in practices that we don't think are American enough, or in other words, we don't think they're Protestant practices.
Right.
And so, yeah, they were trying to enforce that kind of viewpoint on the world.
And it wasn't the first time that the church, would bring up about the First Amendment, right? The Amendment of freedom of religion. Even though the Mormons, before the time of 1886, they were still being persecuted.
Yeah.
Before they were living plural marriage, right? The gospel of Christ, Christ himself talks about, and he says, as they persecuted me, so will they persecute you, because, no servant is greater than his master. And so the thing is that we have to understand is when it comes to this gospel, persecution is something that has to follow, according to even just Christ's words, right? So
you kind of just have to be patient with that, right? Yeah. There's going to be persecution.
Yes. So when it comes back to the Revelation of 1886, John Taylor was in a little bit of a predicament, right? He could either sign away this document that was being presented to him that would later be signed with Wilford Woodruff, at least it's talking very similar, that would say we're no longer going to be practice principle, we're done with that kind of thing, or he could not, and they would continue to be persecuted. So it was a really tight situation. So a council was called in Centerville, Utah, where a group of people came together and they had a conversation for several hours, right? Majority of the day, I think it was, where they were trying to figure out if they should stop living the principle of plural marriage. John Taylor eventually decided that I'm going to go to the Lord and pray about this matter, and I will come and tell you the response on the morrow. So he goes to the home of a man named Lawrence C. Woolley, right? And at the home of Lawrence C. Woolley, his father, John W. Woolley, was the bodyguard of John Taylor during that time period. He was staying at his son's home. And so John.
Well, I think it was the home of John Woolley.
Yeah,
well.
I was a little worried about that. It was Lawrence C. Woolley was the bodyguard. Thank you.
Yeah.
So
drove the wagons around, things like that. Made sure they got their groceries in their mail, because they're in hiding.
Exactly. So his purpose was to make sure that no one got into the room of the president's and bedroom while he was staying at the home. And so he locked all the doors. He locked all the doors to the home and the windows. There was actually only one door to John Taylor's room. And so he was standing outside, or sitting, and he was actually reading his Doctrine of Covenants when he began to hear voices coming from the room, and he saw light coming from the bottom of the door. And so he started to panic because, someone got in. How did they get in? I was in front of the only door.
Right, there shouldn't be a conversation in there. Because
exactly.
John Taylor's the only one in there, and my whole job is to make sure he gets to be alone, that nobody can come and bother him.
And it wasn't like he was hearing John Taylor talking to himself. He said he heard three distinct voices. They were different in tone and everything. And so he goes to the door, we're getting ready to open it to save the president kind of thing, when he feels the Spirit tell him, everything's okay, go back to your post. He's like, okay, well, I don't know what's going on, but everything's okay. And so he goes back to his post, and he sits there for the remainder of his shift. And during that time, he says he can hear the voices audible enough to tell that, just pinpoint where they are in the room, but not what they're saying, kind of thing. And, a little bit of just rushing forward. The next day comes, and John Taylor comes out of his room, and Lawrence C. Woolley has to shield his eyes because the president's face is glowing brightly, like Moses when he came down from Mount Sinai.
Wow.
Right?
So there's that spiritual power, that light emanating from John Taylor.
Exactly.
So yeah, that's really cool.
And so Lawrence C. Woolley asked him, well, what did you see, President Taylor? Like, who were those men? He said, Lauren, my boy, that was the prophet Joseph Smith and Jesus Christ. And so from there, they go back to the house where they had been having a discussion the day prior, and he places President John Taylor places his hand upon the document, and he says, sign this document, never. I would rather my hand be severed from my wrist than sign such a document. To paraphrasing, to preach this document, never. I'd rather my tongue be ripped from the root of its mouth than to preach such a document. And so the response from the Lord was a resounding no. You are not to stop living this principle of plural marriage. And so from there, an event took place where 7 men were called to what's called the Council of Friends. And that is a topic in and of itself, but this just goes to show that even though people argue that the manifesto was where it ended, it still was being practiced.
Could it all have been taken away? I mean, could Wilford Woodruff or Russell Nelson or any of these guys, could they say, oh, I'm sorry, you might want to live this way, but you don't. You consenting adults don't get to consent to this. We get to take away the power. You're not allowed to live plural marriage anymore. Can they do that?
Can they take away?
Can they take it away?
Well, when it comes to the Lord's ordinances, right? I think one thing that it said is, what came first, the church or the priesthood?
Right? Chicken and the egg kind of question, right? But I think that the answer to that is that the priesthood was clearly restored, according to those revelations, before the church was organized, right? In fact, on April 6th, 1830, when the church was formally organized, there were already elders, and they performed baptisms. So they had to have had the priesthood before they organized the church.
The thing is, you have to understand, the church and the priesthood are not inseparable. They can't, because the priesthood is only associated with the church as long as the church is obeying the principles and ordinances of the priesthood. If they're going against those, the priesthood it separates from the church. It's not the church. They can't just hold on to it and say, well, we're not doing it right, but you can't leave, kind of thing, right? So the priesthood is the defining entity, right? It's greater than the church. The church is not greater than the priesthood. The priesthood is greater than the church, because though the church can decide which laws we want to live, they can't decide the laws, right? It's still up to the priesthood to say, this is a law, and this is a law, and we're going to be living it. It's not to say, the church can't say that law is false and this one is right because we say this.
So for example, are you saying that if the whole church got together and they all held a vote, do you want to accept the Book of Mormon or not accept the Book of Mormon? We could have a vote like that, right? And we could be like, no more Book of Mormon, get rid of it. Right? We could do that for our own church. But I guess what you're saying is that if we were to do that, it doesn't mean the Book of Mormon isn't true. It just means we don't have it anymore.
Exactly.
Right? So in 1890, we have a conference where they say who here is willing to give up plural marriage, and a bunch of people are. And even today, a lot of people don't want to live the principle of plural marriage, and they opt out. They say, not for me, I'm voting against the plural marriage. I'm voting to do away with it. They can do that all they want.
Oh, yeah, they can.
But that doesn't actually take away plural marriage. All it does is it separates them from it, because an eternal principle, it's always there. It's always available. You're just cutting yourself off from that blessing.
There was another quote I probably should read. This it's not exactly, but it goes very well.
And this is found in the Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith?
Yet again, one of my favorite books. Page 18. It's a little bit of reading, but I'll get to it, I promise you. It says, His word will go forth in these last days in purity, for Zion will not purify herself, so to be approved of in all things in his sight. He will seek another people. For his work will go on until Israel is gathered, and they who will not hear his voice must expect to feel his wrath. Let me say unto you, seek to purify yourselves, and also the inhabitants of Zion, lest the Lord's anger be kindled to fierceness. So the thing is that it is a dangerous thought to think that because we're the church, we can't go astray, right? Joseph Smith was saying that the church needs to be in purity, or God will just have to go for another people, right?
Interesting. So yeah, it's not just that. So I guess we can't really tie God's hands, right? Either we will embrace the gospel in its fullness and in its purity, or God will find people who will embrace it in its fullness and its purity. It's kind of one of those situations. I've thought about it where it's like either I'm on board with Zion, or I get to go to Zion, or somebody else will build Zion, but I can't stop it from happening.
Right.
Another Joseph Smith quote that is well known to a lot of people. It's found in the Wentworth letter. It's probably I'm sure it's in that book as well somewhere. But in the Wentworth letter there's something generally called the standard of truth. And Joseph Smith said, the standard of truth has been erected no unhallowed hand can stop the work from progressing. And I think that that's an interesting phrase. If, in other words, you can decide if you're in or out. You can decide if you're going to obey a commandment or not obey a commandment. But no one can stop God from doing what God's going to do. And so if I think that my perspective in Christ Church is that when the LDS Church decided that they're going to say no more plural marriage, it's not allowed, they're not cutting off the access to living celestial laws from everyone. They're cutting themselves off from learning that celestial law. And so...
it's not a loss to God, it's a loss to them.
It's not a loss to God, it's a loss to them. Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of, in Kirtland, there was some conflict in the Quorum of the 12. There were a couple of members of the original Quorum of the 12 Apostles that left. And some of them never returned to the church. Some of them did later on, but a couple of them completely lost their testimonies. And at the time in Kirtland, there was some talk about saying, look, I think the church needs a new president. Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon, and he did a lot of good things, but he's also pushing the envelope in ways that we don't think are right. We should get a new president. And the story goes that Brigham Young got up and he said, you cannot cut off the prophet of God. You can only cut the tie that binds you to him, and thus break the ties that bind you to God, and cut yourselves off from God and sink your souls to hell. I may be paraphrasing there a little bit.
Sounds like Brigham.
But yes, basically what he's saying is like, you can't change God's laws. You can't change God's revelations. All you can do is reject them. And if you do reject them, you're only cutting yourself off. You can't cut off Joseph Smith from God. You just cut yourself off from Joseph Smith and cut yourself off from God. And so, yeah, when an ordinance is changed in the temple in the LDS Church, they're not changing the ordinance in the sense that it's still valid, it's just a new way of doing it. What they're doing, from this perspective you're sharing with me, what they're doing is they're cutting themselves off from the ordinances of God. They're losing the ordinance. They're not replacing it. They're just rejecting it and doing whatever it is that they want to do.
It to their biases, right? Making the way they want to be.
Right. And so... one of the other things you brought up that I want you to flesh out a little bit is, okay, so if that's what's happening here in 1890, Wilford Woodruff has got this manifesto. People voted to accept the manifesto. The government took that as a sign that the church was going to stop teaching plural marriage. And plural marriages really didn't cease until other manifestos came out. There's the second manifesto in 1904. And then there's the third manifesto in 1933. And only then does the church really fully separate itself from, us and other Mormon fundamentalists. It's not really different churches until after the third manifesto in 1933. But what you're saying is that through that process, there's still a way, because there's a priesthood. There's still access through the priesthood. Where was the priesthood if it wasn't with Hubert J. Grant and Spencer W. Kimball and Russell M. Nelson, right? Where else could the priesthood be? And how does that relate to this story?
It goes completely with it, actually. So it is actually in relation to just what I brought up before with the John Taylor and the 1886 revelation. Remember those 6 later 7 men that were called, right? They were called for the purpose of practicing the law of plural marriage. It was said that there would not be a child to be born, would not a year go by, there was not a child born into the covenant of plural marriage, right?
Okay, so the idea of and I think it's interesting too, because it's equating two things that the LDS Church doesn't always equate. Being born in the covenant is an important principle. It's this important idea that the covenants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob continue through us and our bloodlines, and that this is a really sacred thing, right? But he's calling them to say not a year will go by that children are not born into the covenant, but he's also equating that to in the covenant through this plural celestial marriage, as being part of that covenant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah, it was through John Taylor that there is authority in priesthood necessary to actually call people to the principle of plural marriage. Now, this in itself is how the Lord was able to continue the principle, even though the church was not as openly living it, kind of thing, right? And there's actually evidence to point to that the church, people would say, well, this was a opposite entity of the church, right? This is just a bunch of people just being polygamous, doing what they want. They weren't even known to the knowledge church. It was actually well known to the church by David O. McKay. David O. McKay would actually send people to this group later on if they want and desire to learn and to practice the principle, right? So it was not a separate entity, it was an appendage to the LDS Church.
That's kind of an interesting thought, too, because it depends on how you look at the timelines. In the history, my understanding is that some people say, oh, well, plural marriages only lived for about 50 years. But it's kind of the other way around. You've got the church publicly embracing plural marriage for about 50 years, but you have plural marriages before that announcement, you have plural marriages after that announcement, all the way up into the 1900s. There were a bunch of people that still had this gray area between the church and plural marriage, Mormon fundamentalists, where they would still refer to each other. There were still lots of people who were members of both organizations. It wasn't really fully split yet in a lot of ways. And I think it's interesting if you look at the time period from the Third Manifesto, when the church really starts excommunicating polygamists in earnest. It doesn't really start until 1933. Up until the founding of Christ Church the Branch in 1978, it's about 50 years.
I didn't know that.
Just a little more than 50 years. And so the way I kind of look at it is there was really only a gray area for about 50 years. The entire history of the church has plural marriage, but for about 50 years there was this gray area where there was some dispute about it. And so to some extent, I feel like it just kind of depends on your perspective or your point of view on that.
Right. I agree.
History. Okay, so you have this Council of Friends. You have these people who knew John Taylor who were continuing these plural marriages even in the church. And then eventually it becomes a separate organization. And that's why today we're not members of the mainstream Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints out of Salt Lake City. We're not part of the same organization. Christ Church the Branch is a completely separate church.
It is, yes.
And yet we still claim that same origin, that Joseph Smith restored the gospel, right? So our founding, we believe, is April 6th, 1830, just like they do. But we've ended up being separate organizations over time.
We have. And we would love to be to be with the LDS Church, right? We'd love to be able to be associated and doing everything they're doing with them in like unity, right? But the problem is, by the choices they have made, they aren't letting us, right? Because if we want to live all of the principles in the gospel and to live plural marriage, to live the consecration to the highest way it was, we can't be a part of their church.
Right. I mean, like right now, the LDS Church policy is to excommunicate.
Yeah, we get excommunicated on the spot.
You know, or withdraw the church membership, I think is the official term now, from anybody who embraces these things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's just honestly, when it comes to Christ Church Branch, the purpose of the church is not just to live plural marriage. Like a lot of fundamentalist groups, people look at, they're like, oh, they're all about polygamy.
It's just about polygamy, right?
Yeah,
That's the only reason why you guys are different is just it's all about polygamy, right?
Right.
But you're saying it's more than that.
It's more than that, right? We're trying to live everything, right? We're trying to do the things that even these fundamentalist groups don't do, right? If you look at all the fundamentalist groups, you're like, okay, there's one thing they don't do that I just, they're almost there. They're almost perfect, right? A lot of them don't do missionary work. As you can tell, we do missionary work. A lot of them don't do temple ordinances for the purpose of the endowment. As we've had a conversation before, we do that, right? So that's what differentiates us from other fundamentalist groups and the LDS Church, is that we are willing and we are dedicated to following all of the principles, commandments of God, including plural marriage.
Right. And so it's one of many things, but it isn't even really the main thing. It's but it is the one that people ask the hard question about, and that's why I appreciate you talking that through with me today, that it's not like we exist just because plural marriage, but plural marriage is one of the ingredients in this complex symphony. It's one of the parts that is part of the gospel, and we're trying to live all of it. And it's not just because we love polygamy so much. I mean, I'm sure some people have good polygamous marriages, but again, some people have, unfortunately, sad polygamous marriages that end in divorce, just like any other marriage. But really, it's about the fullness of the gospel, and this is just one aspect of it. And we have to be able to keep that alive the same way we're trying to keep everything else alive, like the temple ordinances and everything, and the gathering and the doctrines that were taught by Joseph Smith and so forth. We're trying to embrace all of it.
Right.
And so I appreciate you answering my questions today. Those of you who've joined us, I hope that you will subscribe, that you will hit a like, and then leave us a comment. Elder Keith here may yet be able to actually answer your comments if you leave them in the comments section. So hopefully you found this discussion on plural marriage interesting. If you have further questions, please leave them in the comments. We'll see if we can get to them. Thanks for joining us today.